right, everyone, should we get started? It's 11:59. We're a little bit early. So this is the last lecture of the morning before lunch, one more hour on capturing trauma, bearing witness to climate events. And it's solely dedicated to one literary text, Jhumpa Lahiri's Going Ashore. It's from her second collection of short stories called Unaccustomed Earth. In your packet of readings, I gave you the entire story, Going Ashore, so if you have time to read it, that will help fill in the gaps. I'm always interested in kind of talking to people about Lahiri. She has been canonized as a part of contemporary American teaching, and has been criticized from some sides. Some people would say there's a reason American teachers love to teach Lahiri, and it's because she presents this idealized vision of the South Asian immigrant in the U.S. Her collection, Interpreter of Maladies, ends with a story called Third and Final Continent, which is this very happy settling of an Indian American family. And some critics say maybe that's a little too easy of a story to tell. But this Unaccustomed Earth, I think, is a little more complicated. During our tutorials, I'd love to hear what you think about an author like Lahiri. Her parents were born in South Asia. She was actually raised in the UK and then in Rhode Island, USA. So for her, the third and final continent, it's Asia, and then it's Europe, and then it's the U.S. And she has since gone to Rome, Italy, learned Italian, and started writing only in Italian. So that's another kind of added layer to her career. So we're going to be talking today about going ashore. And we're connecting it also with this idea of climate catastrophe. So this presentation offers a reading of Lahiri's novella Going Ashore with a focus on its representation of the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004. It argues that Going Ashore insists on bearing witness to such catastrophic events as the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and Boxing Day tsunami. Told partly from the point of view of a photographer named Kaushik, the story calls attention to daily traumatic and interrelated occurrences that displace people, occurrences well within the normal range of experience. So we're going to go back to Laura S. Brown, who says, let's talk about redefining trauma as within everyday human experience. It begins with an early hint from Kaushik about what the story is going to be about as he reflects. He was reminded of his family's moves every time he visited another refugee camp, every time he watched a family combing through rubble for their possessions. And it's this statement early on that has me wondering. This is in a novel that is a love story. It is a coming together of a young man and a young woman. And this young man, one of the narrative points of view, is a photographer. And he's going to capture the incoming storm. And my first question is, why in this novella do we open with his memory of his family's moves and visiting refugee camps and watching a family comb through rubble for their possessions? What's the relationship between the refugee camp on the one hand, that is his interest, and then capturing climate events on the other hand? Such observations necessarily call into question the official version of the DSM-4, traditionally used to diagnose survivors with the category outside the range of human experience. As we will discuss, it seems very much like climate catastrophe and housing insecurity, to pick up from last time, are both very well within the range of normal human experience. And so just a reminder about Laura S. Brown. She critiqued the then prevalent third edition for the DSM for defining a traumatic event as, quote, outside the range of human experience. Instead, Brown calls for a more inclusive definition that adequately describes, quote, the effects of exposure to repetitive interpersonal violence and victimization. So for her, the focus is on repetitive interpersonal violence, on victimization, and she sees this happening all the time throughout humanity. So repetitive refers to the condition of living in fear of anticipated violence, catastrophe, or disaster, rather than facing an unforeseen event. Brown asks, what if a traumatic event is very much within the range of human experience? We asked that for the last presentation on Katrina, and can, in fact, be predicted. So even though these disasters are very much a part of people's daily lives, political leaders repeatedly again turn a blind eye to the causes and effects of routine economic, cultural, and climate-related disasters. So related, Lahiri's 2008 short story, Going Ashore, insists on bearing witness to events such as the exemplary case of the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and Boxing Day tsunami. Told partly from the point of view of a photographer named Kaushik, the story itself honors everything he sees through his camera lens: displaced people, war-torn cities, and natural disasters. The story, the final third of a triptych that captures the last few months of the lifelong relationship between an Indian couple, Kaushik and Hema, calls attention to daily traumatic and interrelated occurrences that displace people, occurrences well within the normal range of experience. So reading Going Ashore in this way, we can see how such human traumas as weather events, war, and migration are interrelated in their potential to displace millions of people. Laura Brown's call to understand trauma as well within the range of human experience has implications not only for feminists, she is a feminist, but also for trauma theorists, like all of us, everywhere. So again, I think I said this in the last presentation, I want to think about this not simply as a literary argument or a philosophical argument, but about a legal argument and as a political argument in its dual potential to try to protect disenfranchised people and to bear witness to the otherwise unseen catastrophic events. So the first part of this talk is disaster. Tsunamis are a terrifying exemplar of this phenomenon. On the one hand, they are wholly predictable after effects of intense undersea earthquakes. On the other hand, they can seem unexpected, especially if the earthquake that causes it is dozens of miles away. Reading the historical overviews of the Boxing Day tsunami, it becomes clear how the idea of tsunami is nearly personified, referring to as coming and going ashore, something Lahiri's story reveals as embedded in the language so subtly you barely notice. So I went back to look at historical reportage, like what journalists were saying about this tsunami. According to Jose Barrero, the tsunami, quote, came ashore in these places that had no natural warning either, because they were far enough away that they didn't feel any of the earthquake. So there came ashore. The tsunami came ashore. It's interesting to me that Lahiri picked up on that language for the title of her story, Going Ashore. 15 years later, Reuters staff recalled how, quote, day by day the death toll rose as bodies littered the streets, waiting to be collected, and others continued to wash ashore, decaying among piles of debris. And that changes the connotation of the title a little bit, right? Going ashore, I think about it as a couple who are going to the shore. But read through the history of the tsunami and the coverage of the tsunami, if you think about phrases like bodies continue to wash ashore, then you have another resonance. It's deeply tied up with the effects of the tsunami. Going Ashore invites and refuses metaphorical readings in order to see these horrors more clearly. Quite literally, it refers to the arrival of the tsunami surge at the shores of Khao Lak, where Kaushik is staying. We might be tempted to think about it metaphorically or allegorically, however. Hema and Kaushik feel untethered separately, but grounded when they are together. This is a third story about them in this collection. The literal approach of the tsunami is unexpected in the story's final pages, just as it was unexpected for the hundreds of thousands of people affected that day. In fact, the event itself cannot be narratively explained. There is a black imprint of a lone leaf in the space of the page where the tsunami goes ashore. In this representation, the story representing the effects of the tsunami, there is no description of the tsunami. It's a little leaf. So we can kind of think about how that works visually in our breakout groups. Readers have access to the experiences of Kaushik just before the tsunami and the experiences of Hema just after. The story uses free indirect discourse to alternate between them until the very end, when Hema shifts between first and second person to address Kaushik following his sudden death. After his separation from her, his lover, he is visiting a small resort north of Khao Lak and befriends a Swedish man named Heinrich, who reports there is talk in the hotel of a, quote, small earthquake. People seem unconcerned. Whatever happened, we learned, Kaushik had slept through it. He thought back to the day in El Salvador when he'd taken his first real picture and the tremor that had come just before. The news spilling from its bowls, the young man in impeccably clean tan trousers lying in a pool of blood on the street. He sees everything like a photographer sees things, right? He is a photographer. He carries a camera and is ready to capture these images. Natural disaster is connected here with personal or political disaster via the profession of the photographer. The tremor of the gunshot, the death and violence from an earlier moment becomes inextricably bound up with the tremor of the earthquake. The reader tragically knows that the natural disaster, rooted in an intensely powerful 10-minute quake, not a tremor, is coming even while Kaushik downplays it, observing that he, quote, slept right through it. When on a boat later that day with Heinrich and an unnamed Thai boy who serves as their guide, Kaushik has a vision of his mother as the boy, quote, guided them close to the shore, at once a callback to the story's title, Going Ashore, and a foreshadowing of the effects of the tsunami. When he decides to swim to a cove, as Heinrich has, it is a rare instance when he is without his camera, and what happens next, no one witnesses. Not even Kaushik, who has sought a career capturing man-made and natural disasters alike. What does it mean to be present without your camera? How do we bear witness to this event, is what I ask myself. The last we see him, he lowers himself out of the boat. The sea is ironically described as, quote, warm and welcoming as a bath. In a decision that reflects a sense of freedom, he lets go of the boat when his feet touch the bottom. The phrase, so he let go, ideally would be the final words of his story. And although it is the final time we see him alive, we learn after the appearance of that leaf-shaped imprint that Hema has stepped in to try to fill in the gaps, to describe the traumatic loss of Kaushik and hundreds of thousands of others. So the way this is narrated is the man enters the water, it is warm and welcoming as a bath, and that is the last time we see of him or hear him. The next narrative voice is his lover. The next line, filtered through her perspective, reflects the early response of all of us who have failed in our witness. All day I was oblivious, she says. The story structure, leaving a visual mark where the tsunami takes place, reflects the culture's gap in understanding what takes place in the moment of the landfall of a tsunami or any catastrophe. How do you write that? The story presents us with the before, Kaushik leaving the boat, and the after, consisting of obliviousness and incomplete television coverage that Hema describes. So this is her. She's watching television coverage try to depict the events. This is kind of long. I don't know if you can see it. On television, in a pink sitting room with stark fluorescent light, I saw images of the Indian and Sri Lankan coastline, glimpses from vacationers' video cameras never intended to capture such a thing. I saw a massive surge of water moving so quickly that the tape seemed to be playing at an unnatural speed. At first, it was only the damage in South India and Sri Lanka I was aware of, the fishing villages that had been obliterated, tourists stranded on Vivekananda's rock, and then I learned that Thailand had also been hit very badly. This is very different language than Jasmine Ward's, right? Jasmine Ward is the poetic, I will tie shards of glass. This is Aimee reporting straightforwardly what she saw on TV. Her straightforward first-person narrative seems clinical in its precision, although nothing seems effectively depicted. In its way, her description reflects those reports from news sources, or historical accounts that seem utterly unable to fill in the gaps. The word capture seems almost ironic in the sense that the truth both is and is not captured. The key words here, such as damage and obliterated, allow us to understand that there were effects, but not to grasp the magnitude of them. I don't know about you. Is there like an effective dimension? Do you understand like the subjective truth just yet? This brief overview shifts then to a very personal second-person address. From Aimee to Kaushik, whom we presume to be dead, she continues. She's talking to him. She's addressing him, whom we think is her dead lover. The next morning, I went to the newsstand and bought for the papers, studying every picture, looking for your name in one of the credits, hoping you had been lucky and that you had continued to do your work. I went to the internet center, drew up your website. I saw the images you had posted, a faint sliver of the shoreline we had seen from Valterra. 3 blackened faces, supposed to be Etruscan divinities, and that loomed over our heads, and then scenes of another coast, 2 children playing, a gentle turquoise sea. Aimee's desire to find the truth in the newspaper, her hope that a lover had survived, proven by his own photography of yet another disaster to witness, reflects the comfort and closure we all seek. I'm going to go to the web and see if I can find the truth. It is nearly impossible to accept the fact that so many, including Kaushik, had perished so quickly and without warning. As with television coverage, glimpses are, quote, captured through the papers and the internet, his images reflecting not the tsunami that swallowed him, but one of their last shared moments together, studying the Etruscans and children playing in what appears to be a peaceful sea. That's the capturing part, which ironically is not capturing. And then part 2 is trauma. And this revisits Laura S. Brown in the context of this story. In our contribution to Carew's exploration in memory, so that's the edited collection where we also saw the interview with the AIDS activists and Carew's definition of trauma, she also has an essay by feminist therapist Laura S. Brown, whom we mentioned. And she asked what she might contribute to a discussion of trauma, returning to the 1987 definition of post-traumatic stress disorder. And in doing, she reconsiders this definition from the DSM-3. We're now up to the DSM-4. The person has experienced an event that is outside the range of human experience. She reflects on a former patient who is an incest survivor, and a moment testifying on her behalf, when a defense attorney cross-examines her, asks how the woman could be traumatized if incest was, quote-unquote, relatively common. So this is a lawyer, Laura S. Brown, takes an incest survivor to court and was dismissed early on because if PTSD is defined as outside the range of human experience, and incest was quote unquote relatively common, you do not have grounds through the definition of PTSD. So Laura S. Brown worked to change that. Brown recalls that she had just testified that, quote, as many as a third of all girls are sexually abused prior to the age of 16. And that, she says, is very much inside the range of human experience. And the defense attorney tries to use her logic against her. Brown asks us to define trauma in a way that allows for a firm understanding of traumas such as domestic abuse and rape as both anticipated and regular occurrences in the lives of underrepresented people, and there I would include women. She distinguishes between events that had the power to disrupt the lives of the dominant class and those unacknowledged events that disrupts the lives of others. And that leads her to think, who gets to define PTSD, right? Maybe it's upper middle class men who have a way to kind of imagine it that works for them, that fits them. For her, quote, war and genocide, which are the work of men and male-dominated culture, are agreed upon traumas. So are natural disasters, vehicle crashes, boat sinking in the freezing ocean. 25 years later, we can also see, perhaps belatedly, how war, genocide, and natural disasters are very much within the range of all human experience. Brown argues that that's Douglas Crimp. Oh, okay, I just forgot to delete that. That was from yesterday. Okay, here's Brown. We are, quote, challenged by such a feminist analysis and the questions that emerge from it to examine our definitions of human and to observe how our images of trauma have been narrow and constructed within the experiences and realities of dominant groups and cultures. How would you define human, and how would you define experience? Perhaps we can use this analysis to consider how weather events in Southeast Asia or homelessness among the American working poor that we talked about last time, or drug addicts living on the margins, and now I'm thinking about your work with incarcerated people. Like, we can think about all of these groups living on the margins are processed as somehow less than traumas of white middle-class men, something Lahiri implicitly questions by representing two Indian protagonists affected directly by the Boxing Day tsunami. As the summer of 2021 has shown, and the summer of 2022 and 23 and 24, climate change and the daily traumatic effects now very much are within the range of human experience. It's on the radar because it now affects everyone, even the wealthy, even white men. And at the end of Browning's writing, the DSM has in fact been evolving. By the time her essay appeared in 1995, the DSM had launched a fourth edition. Brown points out that criterion A for post-traumatic stress disorder will no longer require that an event be infrequent, unusual, or outside of the mythical human norm of experience. So I think this history of the evolving definition is also very interesting. In 1980, it's outside the range of human experience, and by 1995, it is no longer required to be a determinant, that the event does not have to be infrequent, it does not have to be unusual, it does not have to be outside of any kind of mythical norm of experience. I like that she uses the word mythical to show simultaneously how, quote, human experience is often collapsed to, quote unquote, white males. That's something that Audre Lorde says. There's a mythical norm, at least in American discourse. And how infrequently we have considered the perspectives of the global South. I think that's what Lahiri is saying also. Brown's essay cuts two ways, even today, but reveals belatedly how extreme daily life has become. Brown concludes that even the DSM-4 definition, quote, falls short. While the debate is moving forward in the field of trauma, some of the questions raised by a feminist analysis about the nature and meaning of the continuum of trauma in a world where some people are never free of exposure to some sort of traumatic stressor continue to be salient and necessary. The DSM, most recently updated in May of 2013, seems to have left behind the phrase outside the range completely. The most comprehensive and lucid overview of the changes, alongside an updated definition, can tellingly be found on a special website of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, which specifies that PTSD is a response to an external event via exposure to death, threatened death, injury, or sexual violence. For those of you who are psychiatrists or psychologists here, it might be interesting to go down the rabbit hole of the definitions that psychologists use. And even as I say this, I'm wondering now, if we all went to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, would we see a definition of PTSD? The current U.S. administration has been erasing a lot of these things, like the influences of African American history, research into women and abuse. Even now, if there is an application for the National Institutes of Health that includes the word trauma, it's put on the, in the circular bin, as they say. So maybe we'll do that tonight. Let's see if the definition of PTSD in terms of Veterans Affairs is still on the U.S. Department's website. Criterion A incorporates consideration of Brown's and others' critique regarding the ways in which women's experiences were overlooked, and now specifies, quote, the person was exposed to death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. And criterion B says the traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in the following ways: unwanted upsetting memories, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress, and physical reactions after exposure to traumatic reminders. So working on this essay in the wake of COVID-19, that comes up a lot with me. I would also like to discuss with you whether COVID-19 lockdown was as traumatic for you as it was for me. And after rereading Lahiri's story, I have begun to wonder whether the DSM-5 criterion B for trauma might soon apply to all of us. We consistently brace for and too often experience either first or secondhand catastrophic events. Have you seen that meme by young people that say, every single day is a new trauma? Thank you. I'd rather have one generational altering event in my life and not one every day. I feel like we have to revisit criterion A. One can experience trauma in a variety of ways: through direct exposure, witnessing trauma, learning that someone close to us is exposed to trauma, right? That's a huge one. Indirect exposure in the case of professional duties. In the current context, Elizabeth Frankenberg and et al. Have begun to compare the traumatic effects of the Boxing Day tsunami with the effects of COVID-19. Frankenberg's research team considers, quote, the evidence for how the extraordinary stresses of the tsunami affected survivors' health and well-being. A large fraction of the people in our study reported high levels of post-traumatic stress symptoms. For some, these resolved quickly, but for others, they persisted for several years. Again, this is another thing you don't just get over. Adding that, quote, much of what has been learned from that disaster is relevant when considering how the world will recover from the coronavirus pandemic. Can the research into the effects of the surviving the tsunami apply to those of us who have survived the COVID pandemic? It might seem counterintuitive to link the traumatic effects of the tsunami of 2004 with the traumatic effects of COVID-19. One is an extreme geological event, while the other is a once-in-a-century pandemic. I imagine there are so many models in which to base a recovery project, probably too many to count. However, the sheer and sudden loss of hundreds of thousands of lives make it relevant. A rereading of Lahiri's story reveals that interrelated motifs include the possibilities of photography in capturing daily traumas and the ways that natural disasters and migrancy are linked. Going Ashore is a complex narrative enriched by the fact that the entire story, up until the last 3 pages, is not about an extreme weather event at all. I've chosen 3 pages of a very long story to look at in terms of weather. It depicts the pleasant reunion of 2 lovers. While Aimee, a Western-trained scholar learning about the Etruscans, works in an apartment in Italy, she encounters her childhood friend, Kashik, who also knows Aimee's Italian friends. Kashik is introduced with references to his 2 decades of photojournalism work covering such traumas as a bombing in Netanya and a refugee camp in Honduras. So now I'm going to kind of think about how his photography, as represented throughout the story, might help us understand what he was trying to get at with the tsunami. Reflecting on the power and possibilities of his photography trips, Kashik, quote, was reminded of his family's moves, this is a quote from the beginning, every time he visited another refugee camp, every time he watched a family combing through rubble for their possessions. In the end, that was life. A few plates, a favorite comb, a pair of slippers, a child's string of beads. Uncannily, this imagery, the imagery we started with, anticipates the aftermath of the tsunami that closes the story. Rubble left where houses and cottages were on the shore, the only sign of human life in our imagination, a favorite comb or string of beads. In this moment, Kashik's frequent moves as a child relate to his photographic interests in refugee camps, and this imagery further becomes bound up in the future with coverage of catastrophes. So when he remembers taking pictures of a few plates, a favorite comb, a pair of slippers, a child's string of beads from refugee camps, we now can see how those images might play out in the aftermath of the tsunami. His connection with migrancy is also reflected in the terms he and Aimee admired during the trip to Garamaki Etruscan Museum, where they see hundreds of them, quote, the slides covered with carvings showing so many migrations across lands and departures. The power of photography to capture perpetual movement is further reinforced when Kashik shows Aimee his website, the very website she returns to when trying to discover if he is still alive after the tsunami. We have at this moment access to her point of view, not his, as she interprets their significance. So, the image of the website, what she sees. There were countless images, terrible things she'd read about in the newspaper and never had to think about again. Buses blasted apart by bombs, bodies on stretchers, young boys throwing stones. He had witnessed these things, unseen and uninvolved, yet with an immediacy she had never felt. This is the power of photography, the story tells us. The photographs, image after image, testify to a history she had never fully experienced. The brief catalog here works via alliteration of the plosive sound B. Buses, blasted, bombs, bodies, boys. Are there any linguists in here? It's like that plosive sound, ba, 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 has an effect. All words connoting a war zone and its impact on the youth. Even the young Thai boy who guides Kashik and Heinrich on the boat just before the storm. If she had read about these things and forgotten about them, the images provide a sense of immediacy in retrospect. This reflection leads her to her second observation about photography, about the ways it connects people. Quote, as she looked at the pictures, she began to appreciate his ability, perhaps his need, to connect to strangers in this way, and the willingness of strangers to connect to him. She began to understand his willingness and she thought perhaps this was also a need to disappear at any moment. Not only does she better understand Kaushik, his, quote, need to connect and simultaneously to disappear, but also she better understands the power of photography to capture everyday traumatic experience. So part 3, are there any photographers in here? I know there are. I've seen some of your Instagram accounts in the last couple of days. This is for all the photographers. The figure of photography in Going Ashore, its insistence on capturing an event, witnessing a traumatic moment, and connecting with others, reminds us of the perpetual failure of language to represent the unimaginable on the one hand, and the critical nature of empathy on the other hand. It is no accident that Lahiri presents the Boxing Day tsunami story with not one narrator, but 2, with both failing to depict the impact of the moment, while both explicitly acknowledging the impact of photography. Lahiri is not the first to recognize the theoretical practice and significance of photographs, but she emphasizes its potential to capture what might otherwise go unseen by connecting thematically war zones, migrant stories, and the Boxing Day tsunami. In this discussion of images, I'm thinking about the researcher doing graphic novels, right? This works in a similar way. Like, some words cannot capture effectively traumatic experience, so we go to images. In this way, her literary work evokes Marianne Hirsch's family frames, which connects Roland Barthes' theorization of the photograph in camera lucida to contemporary uses of photographs. I think a lot of you, maybe some of you, have read Family Frames for Hirsch's interest in intergenerational trauma, right? I'm really interested in what she says about photographs. For Barth, photographs embody what he calls punctum, quote, that prick and shock of recognition, that unique and very personal response to the photographic detail that attracts and repels at the same time. Such a shock of recognition, I think shock of recognition is used in Esau McCulley and also Rita Sharon. Such a shock of recognition, particularly of a human subject, amid a catastrophic moment, connects us to one another. As Aimee says, Kaushik's photography both protects him from becoming part of the scene, distancing him, but also allows him to connect belatedly. Their shock of recognition, in terms, motivates people to respond. Photographers are pretty protected, right, behind that lens. On the other side is catastrophe. Photographs demand that we confront otherness. Hirsch argued that the history of a group, through photography alone, quote, survives by means of its narrative and imaginary power, a power that photographs have a particular capacity to tap. For Hirsch, photography has a unique power to testify to trauma. Despite photography's potential, when Aimee looks at Kaushik's portfolio before the tsunami, the story leaves us feeling unsettled. Not only has he left his camera on the boat, but also he is washed ashore with the other tsunami victims. The story offers us no closure, only the traumatic loss of Kaushik's voice, just as his feet touch the water, followed by the traumatic emergence of Aimee's voice saying that she was oblivious to the fact of the catastrophe the next day. In this way, the story rejects dominant cultural models for grief embodied by the funeral, wake, elegy, or proper linguistic or even photographic depictions of an event. We want closure. When somebody dies, we want to be able to celebrate their lives and get closure and move on. Lahiri's story refuses that. It refuses closure. It refuses reparation in two senses. It rejects the idea that, quote, something can be learned from this moment, and it also fails to comfort us with a definitive historical artifact. Jahan Ramazani articulates this anti-reparative tendency in the modern text as an attempt to, quote, reopen the wounds of loss, a quality the story achieves by pointing to the unsettling traumatic legacy of the refugee camps as well as global crises that surround us today. In response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Hirsch writes that she had to update her theory to argue that, quote, photographs might enable us to look at an indescribable event to make it manageable. We look at the remains of the towers, at the missing people, through the viewfinder rather than straight on. Lahiri's text does not work like that. Aimee finds pictures in the newspaper, but they are not described, not like the ones Kaushik takes, referred to earlier in the story. Someone has witnessed the tsunami through a viewfinder, we imagine, but it was not Kaushik who perished unexpectedly. Hirsch, like Lahiri's Kaushik and photojournalists of the 21st century, understand that, quote, through photography, I can become a witness in my own right. This is not unlike the language of witness and responsibility that Lindsay Addario, a young photographer during the aftermath of 9/11, sees in her own photography memoir. A photojournalist with experience in Afghanistan, when America invaded in 2003, Addario asks, quote, when do we have enough reporting and photographs to depict the story accurately? We always want more than what we have. Like Kaushik, like Hirsch, Addario says, quote, we bear witness to history and influence policy. She exalts, quote, the privilege of witnessing things that others do not, an idealistic belief that a photograph might affect people's souls, the thrill of creating art and contributing to the world's database of knowledge. I like that phrase, photography might affect people's souls. This is perhaps where we can pull the thread forward in the wake of the coronavirus epidemic. Photography capturing illness, homelessness, suffering, loss, climate change, and suffering in the wake of severe weather events can perhaps inspire policymakers to do the right thing on behalf of those traumatized and displaced. The power of Lahiri's story is that it offers this possibility as well as an all too realistic appraisal of its likelihood. And back to kind of reading this early 21st century story in the context of the 2020s. I want to talk about the ways in which the final weeks, for example, of July 21, revealed how Lahiri's fiction uncannily foretold multiple occurrences of perpetual weather trauma. On July 17, 2021, the New York Times reported on its 5th page that Danish Siddiqui, a Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist from Reuters, was killed in Afghanistan. According to Christina Goldblum and Fahim Abed, Siddiqui, an Indian national, was, quote, covering a clash between Afghan security forces and the Taliban, and was, quote, the first foreign reporter to be killed in the Afghan conflict since the U.S. and international forces began withdrawing from the country in May, and the Taliban began a sweeping military offensive. His obituary appeared the same weekend in July 21 as the coverage of flooding in Germany. I have some German scholars in here. One headline read, quote, no one is safe, with the subtitle, Extreme Weather Batters the Wealthy World. This was the first week when towns in Germany and Belgium were submerged under rivers that overflowed and broke through their banks, killing at least 170 people. It was the same week when hundreds of U.S. Americans died in heat in the northwestern United States, known for its cool, temperate weather. And it was the same week when wildfires moved across 12 western states. As Sengupta has recently observed, quote, the extreme weather disasters across Europe and North America have driven home 2 essential facts of science and history. The world as a whole is neither prepared to slow down climate change nor live with it. If we may learn anything from literary fiction written by a U.S. author of Indian descent, educated in Europe, and the photography of photojournalists around the world, it is that we are all living now with the traumatic effects of climate change and the weather, that we are all bystanders to radical crises of migration and housing, but things needn't be so bad. Safety nets can help us, and so will radical empathy. So that leads me to some questions. I also want to add a fifth. Like, what do you think about Jhumpa Lahiri as an author? Like, honestly, I love her. So I'd be curious to hear what you think. Okay, so can the art of photography bear witness differently than the written word? What is special about photography? Should I keep going? I'll keep going. Can you hear me? Okay. This isn't because I'm like saying these like critical things about the world, is it? How do you interpret Lahiri's story Going Ashore? How do you account for the DSM's revision of the definition of trauma from including the original phrase outside the range of human experience? And what might be the relationship between displaced migrants and extreme weather events? Should we go back to a... Oh, it's okay. The world is not ending. Oh, maybe it is. That's an old one. So maybe we can talk about this for our discussion. What I was trying to say is we can pair the protagonist's reflection of what she sees of the effects of the tsunami with what the story seems to be saying about photography. So what do you make of this description of the effects of the tsunami as seen through Aimee? On television, in a pink sitting room with stark fluorescent light, I saw images of the Indian and Sri Lankan coastline, glimpses from vacationers' video cameras never intended to capture such a thing. I saw a massive surge of water moving so quickly that the tape seemed to be playing at an unnatural speed. At first, it was only the damage in South India and Sri Lanka I was aware of, the fishing villages that had been obliterated, tourists stranded on Vivekananda's rock, and then I learned that Thailand had also been hit very badly. Is this an effective representation of what Kaushik might have seen, for example? Keywords, lines. To me, it feels very sterile, but maybe it is an effective, gives us some lists. How does she see the effects as mediated through television? Yes, thank you. I have two class leaders. Well, I saw this hand over here first. Oh, the microphone is coming.
Thank you. So as you said that, is it an accurate representation of what Kaushik could have felt?
Okay.
So I think no, because she is sitting in a pink room, as she said. So she is like a third person witnessing events from far away. But what Kaushik is witnessing is pure horror. He can see that his life flashing before his eyes.
Yes.
So, of course, both are very different perspectives. She is just writing it in a literary way and representing what Kaushik might have felt.
That's so great. I love that line. Of course she isn't experiencing this. Like, she's sitting in a pink room. Why is the room pink? A sitting room. The stark fluorescent light, I think, is also related to that. She's in an institutional kind of setting. And then from there, she sees images of the coastline, but that is nowhere near the impact that the people there felt. All right. There was a hand over here, I thought. Maybe not. Okay. Okay, maybe I'm just seeing things. It's like when my students put their hands on their heads. I'm like, yes, you have something to say.
The word only in the second last sentence, it gives
Yes.
like the damage in India and Sri Lanka was as immense as the damage that happened in Thailand.
Yes.
But when she is describing it, until the last sentence where she realizes that the Thailand has also been hit, it is only the damage in India and Sri Lanka. It's the most, it's one of the depictions of trauma. Unless it happens to you,
Yes.
it is not as massive.
Yes.
And trauma theory has always tried to hint to that, how something happened to us personally is way more bigger and massive than anything that could happen in the world. And the subjectivity of it. And
Yes.
we can clearly see that in the passage. There is even the description of the room she is sitting in. She's paying attention to everything until she learns that Thailand has been hit.
Yes.
Then it all becomes very personal.
Yes, that's such a great point. Obliterated. Fishing villages, right, had been obliterated. She looks at the damage in South India and Sri Lanka, and then, it just seems like an afterthought, right? And then I learned that Thailand had also been hit very badly. So obliterated, right? The places that she feels affinity toward, and then it's like Thailand is an afterthought with the and then, and we're called to imagine what Thailand must have experienced also. That line also reminds
water. But here I can connect this thing with one of the paintings that came out in 1993 by Kevin Carter, and that famous painting was called The Vulture and the Little Girl. And after taking that picture, Kelvin Carter won the Pulitzer Prize for Best Feature Photography, but he was heavily being criticized because he was inactive after seeing the wretched condition of the little girl, because it portrayed the famine affected Sudan, and one vulture was waiting for the little girl for eating the little girl. So first-hand experience is more traumatic than when we put those things into words. When other persons read about those things, they are not that much traumatized when we talk about the person who is facing that trauma from their own experiences.
Yes, that's a great point. I mean, photographs are not objective, right? They have their own point of view that we need to think about. There's even been some research done on what drives a photographer in extreme situations to, instead of getting involved, stay behind the lens, right? And so, what would it mean to get involved kind of as an ethical witness in the way we've been defining it, and then what does it mean to stay behind the camera? Photographers would say maybe their work is, in keeping with it. It is also important. And then the other thing is, what does it mean? This was discussed with regard to representing the 9/11 jumpers, right? To photograph the final moment of someone who has decided to jump from a building and commit suicide seems sacrilegious from many points of view, right? Maybe leave that one alone. We don't need to photograph that.
Ma'am, another thing I forgot to mention, that after clicking that picture, Kelvin Carter was so much traumatized that he took away his own life. He committed
That's so
suicide.
important. I see what you're saying. So that there's that secondary effect, right? The effect of the witness is also traumatic. That's great. I mean, that is not great, but that's an amazing point. Yes, there's one over here.
As these two have said that in the first sitting that she is sitting in her in her comfort zone. Like she's sitting in her room and watching the TV. So one thing is that whatever traumatic events that we watch through TV or pictures, we can always flip a page, or we can always switch the channel, and we can we can change the mood.
Yes.
So whatever traumatic thing that we are watching on the TV, we can just switch the channel, and we can watch something else always. So maybe we'll empathize with them, we'll connect with them for a moment. But if you really like, for example, I'm from Kerala, so whatever happens in my place, I'll be hooked on to those newses. But the same thing happens in other place, I mean, you won't get connected to that as much, no matter how big it is.
Yes.
So I'm just saying that, that's the another aspect to look at about videos and photos.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're saying videos and photos also allow you to look away, or do not allow you to look away?
It's your choice,
Yes,
actually.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. That's such a great point. And maybe that's one of the limits of like a trauma theory approach to literature. I like to be in my very safe place and say, look, reading this novel can give you access to a traumatic experience. It will help you empathize. It will help you bear witness. But that is not the same as actually being there, right? You can close the book. You can close your eyes. You can turn off the television. So that's a really important correction. Yes, there's a hand way back, maybe penultimate row.
Ma'am, adding to the discussion that we are having, I'll give example from a recent incident in India. It was a terrorist attack in Jammu Kashmir region, Pahalgaon. Now the visual as it came on the television and in newspaper, what attracted the large mass of Indian readers and viewers is the fact that it was so, the visuals were able to convey the trauma. What added to that traumatic effect was that here were tourists who were vacationing, like in the tsunami, Boxing Day tsunami event, 2004. Here, these innocent people had gone there for vacation, and how suddenly death could come from, unknown quarters. So that experience, that it could have been anybody there, conveyed that traumatic, effect to
Yes.
people.
Thank you for saying that. I read that the vacationers' video cameras, and coupled with, there was another one about, where is that? I thought there were two references to like vacationers, and I see that as as critical. Like, here are people like polluting the place, like spending their money as like tourists, but so maybe that is kind of not a great thing. But I hear your point, which is maybe it's very kind of empathic toward them. Here are people who thought they were going on vacation, they were kind of taking in a new space, they thought they were safe, and they walked into like the opposite. So your reading is lovely and generous. Maybe we'll go with that, right? And it also is a message for all of us. Like, we think we're going to go to one place to get away, and that's the very place where we are exposed or vulnerable. Yes.
Mom?
Oh, sorry. Okay, so there's a microphone here, and then we're going to pass it down 4 rows after. Yes.
Okay. From my perspective, the DCM removed the phrase outside the ring human experience because the trauma, how understood to be more common and personal. People can be deeply affected by events that aren't extreme but still distressing to them.
Yeah.
About this.
I love it. And you know what? Sigmund Freud said that too, right? Like a person's own like fantasies can be traumatic, or like anxieties. So where do we draw the line between extreme human experience, tsunami, for example, and then like everyday living in the world, like worries, right? Kind of fantasies of what could happen. I feel like that's a continuum no one has really solved. That's a philosophy question, right? Like that's about human subjectivity. And maybe that's what Laura S. Brown and Kathy Carruth are saying, is we try to find scientific language to put into a book for medical practitioners to line up with behaviors. But that doesn't get to like the soul hurt of humanity, right? Of like being an individual in the world, and the subjective experience, like in a subjective response. So I completely agree with you. Like, how can one phrase get at the heart of what it means to be human, much less a human who's been traumatized, and that could have so many different causes. Yes, and then did you get the microphone? Yes. Okay.
I want to talk about here this line, the tape seemed to be playing at an unnatural speed. So the word unnatural, it caught my... So I want to talk here about the unnatural speed of trauma. And when the catastrophe that takes place, the people are in shock, and people so it is being expected that you're in shock that in that moment only. And the trauma should be maybe, it is just in that moment. But then we also talked about that how there is this delayed response in the trauma, and it might take years or I don't know how much time to being aware that you actually are traumatized even. Or so this entire process is so unnatural. One can look at it that way also, and the healing and the everything. It can be, that this unnatural speed of healing from the trauma.
That's so great. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about trauma theory as ultimately a theory of time, of being outside time. Deferred action, right? Needing a second event to help you process the first event. With this literal description, it seems like a tape has sped up, right? But if we look at the idea of a reference to a natural speed and time, we can take a step out and think about that as being allegorical for traumatic experience. That's really smart. Yes.
Ma'am, everything we learn about in this paragraph is based on what she sees on a television. Mm-hmm. So we can also ponder upon, does more distance mean less empathy?
Yes.
And second of all, the second last line, tourists stranded on Vivekanand's rock. We can also think about, at the end of the day in a news report, when we read the news or see the news on TV, the victims will just be numbers and nothing else.
Yes. Yeah, so you kind of talked about this thread, and we see this also in Salvage the Bones. Ash is trying to figure out what is going to happen by listening to the radio and TV, and that is very incomplete. So we can think about media and mediation, right? We can think about photography as a form of media or mediation, the television, the reporters in the room, right? There will always be a remove. The websites. So that's a great question. To what extent can we as observers, back to your point, really fully know what is happening to people literally undergoing traumatic experience?
Hello.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I want to say that sometime trauma came suddenly. Example, on 12th of June 2025, Air India plane has crashed Ahmedabad, Gujarat. So there are 242 people in the plane, and there are 241 people has suddenly died. And not only who were sitting in the plane, who were sitting in the canteen, hostel, they have also died. So they don't know what happened after 5 minutes, what happened tomorrow. We don't know, we don't have idea. So the innocent people who are sitting in the canteen, they suddenly died. Yes. So it's a part of trauma. And also we can say that double trauma.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. I like that phrase, double trauma. So, and again, we can kind of think about it in terms of what it means to die. And Kaushik has perished in this. But then another question is, what does it mean to survive? What does it mean to look at the coverage, the footage, and to walk away from the event, and then to have to try to explain that, to tell the story? I think that's such an important point, like the secondary effects of trauma. Shoshana Fellman goes as far as to talk about this with regard to teaching Holocaust literature. She said she had an experience of Yale teaching traumatic narratives of the Holocaust, and all of her students seemed to be having traumatic responses as well. So she had to go into like psychoanalyst mode and help the students come to terms with the trauma that they have felt from looking at traumatic narratives. So I think I think you said it best. The secondary response is also important here. We are 5 minutes past, I don't know, our 1 o'clock hour. You did a great job with this passage. Again, we'll have more time together this afternoon to look at questions. But for now, stand up, take a little break, and we'll come together again soon. Thank you for all of your feedback.